So monetizing your writing beyond just selling books. And I think for some folks, when they think like other ways to monetize their author business, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, I think for nonfiction authors, it's maybe a little more obvious, right?
Yes.
Right. If I'm writing a nonfiction or even a series of related nonfiction books, I probably am speaking from some place of authority or I have some expertise, right? There's lots of ways that you could monetize that. But for fiction, I don't know, some people do various things and we can kind of get into some of those ideas that authors can take and run with. But how have you, I guess we'll start there from that place. How have you monetized your nonfiction? And then also, now that you've made this break into fiction as well, and you're monetizing that on the back end, obviously there's the books, but then there's something more after. There's something, a follow-up program is something that you've mentioned. Kind of break the ice for us on the topic and kind of give us an introduction to your mindset and some of the things that you also maybe share and teach with other authors in this respect.
Great. Yeah. So I'll tell you my story first, and then I'll give you some foundational things that drive my thinking in terms of monetizing beyond books, which is what I call it. I wrote my first book was a work of nonfiction called The Power Principles of Marketing, and that was followed by the CEO's Little Black Book on Branding. So just from the titles, you can obviously see my target market. It's CEOs on the C-suite. It's about branding and marketing, both of which are hot buttons in the corporate world, always have been, always will be. And so when I published them, the first one pre-KDP and the second one after KDP started, but I published them as physical books that I had in boxes, right? And I sent them out to a list of CEOs and C-suite executives that I knew would be interested in branding and marketing, or should be anyway. And also talked to leaders of CEO peer groups and leaders of groups where I knew that CEOs were hanging out. And so the books really hit the target market. They triggered a lot of conversation in the marketplace. And so I was asked to go to speak to a lot of CEO peer groups and be on stages at some associations, some events where C-suite executives and VPs were. So I was able to be in front of my market and I was able to speak directly to them from the book. And so after a speaking engagement, and often CEOs would come up and they say, I have your book, would you sign my book? And so it was, validation at the same time of the content of the book. After the speaking engagements, I would often get within 3 weeks to a month, I would get a call from the EVP or the CEO himself. I saw your speaking engagement. I want our people to work with you. And it was as easy as that because I had authority from the book. I had credibility from the speaking. They met me. There was a level of trust that was established. And so we were able to deliver. And so we, in the agency that I had, we literally made millions off of that short sequence, off of that short funnel. Write the book, get it into the right hands, speak, get in front of the right people, and literally like a magnet, the right people would come to me. So when I decided to switch to fiction, I was really thinking very much about how do I take fiction and begin to monetize it in a way outside of the money that the physical or the digital book actually brings. So this has been in my mind for a couple of years as I started to think about doing fiction. In some ways, that helped me in the writing of the book because I was very conscious of what I'm writing in this book that I could then turn into reusable content. And that sounds really weird for fiction, I know. Because it's a story. What I started with, and this was maybe more serendipity than planning, but I started with a theme that I wanted to have go throughout the book. And the theme is the theme of forgiveness and redemption. And that theme winds itself through all 4 books. I didn't realize when I started it was going to be 4 books. I started with one story and the story just expanded. You can see that I'm not a plotter. So I did not have an outline for 4 books when I started writing the first book.
Sure.
But back to
I'll forgive you.
Thank you. I like the term discovery writer.
Right.
And I also prefer Stephen King's method, which is get a really great character, put him in a bad situation, and have him figure his way out or her way out. I love doing that, and that's exactly what happened with Frankie Girl. But back to the monetization, there are a couple of things to keep in mind before we get into what some of the tactics of that might be. The strategy is books are an asset. And so if we think about them as an asset, there is value within those books that we might not see right off the bat. So like you said, Jack, in nonfiction, a lot of nonfiction is written so that there's a follow-on program, so that there's consulting or coaching afterward, not so much in fiction. But when we begin to look at the asset itself and look at the content, we begin to ask ourselves, what within this content can be a solution or of greater value to the reader? So the solution in nonfiction is a solution to a problem, and we're educating the reader about how to fix the problem. And then we help them because they can't do it just from a book. We help them through consulting and coaching. In fiction, redemption, forgiveness, and redemption as a theme, I have discovered, is a solution to a problem that many human beings have. And that is the issue of family dysfunction, broken relationships, broken hearts. And as the series continued to grow and I continued to promote it and write it and finish it, I started getting emails and phone calls and texts from readers who said, after I read Saturday Night, the Trailer Park, which is the first book, which is where the theme, forgiveness and redemption, comes out. The first time that this came to me, a reader said, it's been 6 years since I've spoken with my sister. And after I read your book, I called her, and now we're getting together and we're having a conversation. And that to me was such a validation of the theme outside of the story. And so I started thinking, I think there's something that can be done beyond the book for fiction. And so what I'm currently working on is is an online course. And the online course addresses the process of forgiveness and redemption. How do you actually do that? What's involved? Kind of the Frankie Girl way, so it ties into the book itself. I'm about to launch a monthly meeting for readers for the list that I've built to actually then bring readers in and say, what are the issues that you're struggling with that you want to talk about? Create a safe place for readers to be able to talk about it within the framework of the book, within the formula, if you will, of the book, Jack. And so from the very beginning, so you'll have to write this into your formula now, Jake, because you're not going to think about it a different way anymore. You're going to think about, how can I make this book go beyond the book itself? Now, let me give you a foundational piece of this. Let's talk about perceived value. Perceived value, you buy a book. So if you buy, Kindle Unlimited, you get it for free. You have to pay to be a member. Kindle Digital, let's say what, $2.99, $5.99, $9.99 maybe for back, 15 to 20, 25, and around there somewhere. Perceived value of a book. Perceived value of an online course is anywhere from $49 to $100 to $499 to $1,000. Content from the book into a course can actually have higher perceived value. And then you go from that into some other strategies of, beyond the book, where you're like, oh, the perception of that is even more. And so you get into consulting or coaching programs, even on the fiction side. Now, you think that you may not be solving a problem, but you may be solving a problem that's very different from what you think it might be. Okay. So why do people read your books now? For entertainment, right? Get away from the real world, have a break, give your mind a break, right? But I would ask you to think about why they choose the genre that they choose, and that in the answer to that question is a way for you to go beyond the book. So if people choose fantasy because they want to get away from the real world, what from the book can you create that also helps them accept that or helps them experience that same goal? So I think, Kelly, you were talking about for the words,
Mhm.
gamification, right?
Yeah.
Isn't fantasy perfect for gamification,
Oh, yeah,
Mhm.
absolutely.
right? So where are all the books that should also be games? Like, am I missing?
They're
Does
out
that
there.
happen in the marketplace?
No, it does. In fact, there's one person in particular, Chris Fox, and he writes science fantasy, science fiction. He's maybe kind of stepped away from the mainstream self-publishing industry. Not trying to throw him under the bus or anything. Chris, if you happen to see this, big fan, by the way. But because he has a YouTube channel as well and was part of how he actually monetized himself. And I think a lot of authors do this by accident. This little bunny trail here is they actually wind up talking to writers about writing. And maybe we can put a pin in that and come back to it. But he did actually take one of his worlds and turn it into a role-playing game like Dungeons and Dragons. And I think Dungeons and Dragons, if I'm not mistaken, if I can recall his origin story correctly, is kind of like how he I know he read a lot of science fiction, but he was big into Dungeons and Dragons as a kid. And so role-playing games and that sort of thing came very naturally to him. And so, yeah, he turned it into a game. I know there's other authors out there who have done very similar things as well. So in the fantasy space and in the science fiction space as well, yeah.
Well, a couple of years ago, I read Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow. You guys are familiar with that book on the character as a gaming, kind of set in the gaming world, in the coding world.
Uh-huh.
And that got me thinking about gaming and fiction. And I, at one time, considered writing historical fiction and then seeing if I could write it so that it could be turned into a game. That has not happened, my friends, just to be clear.
Right. But having that mindset from the beginning is maybe an important step. Obviously, if somebody's already written a series of books, that might take some reverse engineering to find out what the value is in there that they're maybe not seeing. But if you know ahead of time, like I could see in certain genres, it could be very easy to pull off. If you know ahead of time, yeah, I have this concept, but it can also I can also communicate it in a game format as well. In fact, this happens in reverse all the time. I like to bring up, I'm a nerd. If you notice on the shelf behind me here, I've got a Magic the Gathering card and a Warhammer 40K figurine, okay? So I'm a total nerd. These two intellectual properties started as games. They started as a card game. They started as a miniature game from the UK where you build plastic figures. They used to be made of pewter and you'd paint them and then battle them and a war game thing. And then they had to come up with stories for, like, the story came second. And so I know I bring them up every now and then and everybody rolls their eyes and it's totally fine. But you can do that in reverse. You can tell a story first and then have a game off of that or whatever it happens to be. So, yeah, I think it happens in reverse a lot. So maybe it's not as preposterous as some people think, right? To be able to do something like that.
No, it's not. What happened this week was DeepSeek. And DeepSeek is going to make gaming and everything else so much easier for all of us. I don't know that I will ever be able to or ever want to use AI to build a game, but I can see a future in the very near future where that can happen much, much easier.
Yeah.
And if you think about, I mean, the root thing that we're looking at here is how do you take the content that you have and make it attractive and engaging for your readers who already love it and who already love you, who already want to be in your world, and do more to keep them in your
right
and make money doing it. So, you know, perceived value, where is the perceived value? The other thing that is foundational to think about is the bigger problem that you solve, the more money that you will make, the bigger impact you will have. So specifically to your nonfiction authors who are listening, go for solving bigger problems in your book because you will have bigger solutions, you will make a bigger impact, you will make more money. The same for fiction. We look at perceived value, look at where you can get the greatest impact, the greatest perceived value.